Okay, so this question format is called critical reasoning, CR. It is challenging because it takes time to understand, and a lot of these stimuli, this text here, right? I call it the stimulus. It's the text with all the data that's relevant. Your job for a critical reasoning question can vary. It can be from weakening the argument to finding out what the assumption is, to trying to explain an apparent paradox. Your job can vary, right? And what your job is, or what your task is, will be defined right there. That's the question, or the question stem. And of course, you have answer options. Now, it is important again to approach this question type and every other question type very, very structurally and also very methodically, right? Because again, like I said, there are a lot of dense details in the stimuli. Also, the answer options are not really meant to make your life simple. They're quite tricky as well. So what do you do? Well, the first thing you do is always, for critical reasoning, and this we suggest and we know it works every time, is read the question stem. Understand what it's asking you to do. Because once you understand that, you can approach the stimuli with sort of a laser focused and try to figure out what is important and zone out whatever is not important. That's the first thing you do. The second thing you do is try to break down the stimuli itself. Once you understand the task, now you can go into the laser focus and take out what is important. Now, this also involves paraphrasing in your notebook all the important details, only the important details, paraphrase it. And you'll realize that many times the key to answering these questions, the key to breaking down the argument will lie in these details. If you do not paraphrase, many times you will miss out on these details and answer based on gut, which doesn't necessarily work in GMAT verbal. And that leads to a lot of mistakes. So to avoid that, to be extremely sure as to what is required, you paraphrase, figure out what the argument is saying, and the third part is predict. Figure out what the answer should do, right? If it's asking you to weaken it, figure out what kind of logic, what kind of data will weaken that argument, even before you look at the answer options, because there will be answer options that will make sense, that you will agree with, but they may have nothing to do with the argument. And when you're doing the test, when you're solving a question, trust me, it's very, very likely that you will miss the scope, you will miss the point of the paragraph because you saw an answer option that you agree with. It is designed for that purpose. So having a clear representation of what the argument is and also making a prediction of what the answer should do will keep your focus extremely narrow, and therefore you will be able to avoid all kinds of traps that are set in the answer option. And of course, the final step is, of course, to go to the answer options, evaluate them, and get rid of the ones that don't make sense. Whatever you're left with, you evaluate, use critical thinking, choose the one that's closest to your prediction or does not have anything wrong with it. So let's try this out. What's the first thing we do? We read the question, right? The argument above assumes that. So notice that there are a couple of words, and in the GMAT you will see a lot of these questions. What does the author assume, or what does the argument assume? And it will call the stimulus an argument. Many of the stimuli are arguments on the GMAT. An argument is not necessarily what you are thinking about. It's not a disagreement between two people. It's rather an opinion or a judgment or a proposal, whatever it is, some kind of conclusion that has been drawn or that has been supported by some kind of reasoning or evidence, right? That's an argument. So it could be a teacher who proposes stricter attendance rules for whatever reason, right? So that's an argument that she says we are going to cut down on the number of leaves that you can take because it will help academic progress and student development overall. That's the reasoning. That's an argument, right? So we've got the question. It's saying the argument above assumes that. There's another aspect there. What does the word assume mean? it essentially suggests that the argument takes things for granted. There are certain aspects of the argument that are not necessarily completely proven. And this is true. For every GMAT argument that you see, there will be aspects that the author takes for granted. Things that are, or rather logical jumps he makes between the evidence and the reasoning and the conclusion. Now the key to answering these questions, these assumption-based or strength and weaken questions, lies in your ability to notice these jumps in logic. So there's a huge thing, there's a huge process that is involved in paraphrasing. We will go through that, right? As long as we do this methodologically, you'll realize that you're able to approach this question with really clear focus. Let's look at the stimulus. Let's read it. So it says, when unemployment rates are high, people with full-time jobs tend to take fewer and shorter vacations. When unemployment rates are low, people tend to vacation more often and go away for longer periods of time. So in a sense, it's saying that's sort of an inverse correlation between vacation time and unemployment rates. Thus, it can be concluded that full-time workers' perspectives of their own job security influence the frequency and duration of this vacation. So on face value, this argument looks nice, right? It seems logical, but know that it need not be. There might be certain things that the author takes for granted, and that's what we need to find out. So if you look at the argument, and if you think about, okay, what is the point this guy is trying to make? And that's what's important here. The point that this guy is trying to make, the author of this argument. Well, you realize that the last sentence sort of is the gist of what he's trying to say. That's what he feels, right? And everything else is reasoning behind it. Now this we call the conclusion. Now the conclusion, therefore, here, I'm going to paraphrase it, and again, this is a very important part of solving critical reasoning questions, especially the medium and the hard ones. So the conclusion here is that there is a, the unemployment rates are high and low, and there is a inverse correlation between that and vacation time. So vacation time goes down and up, right? We don't just stop there, right? We are going to find out why he says it, what evidence or reasoning he uses. The evidence, you'll realize, is that he says that sorry about that. So the conclusion actually isn't about unemployment rates. It's actually about workers' perception, right? So he's saying that the workers' perception of own job security is what's causing the vacation frequencies. Why does he say that? Because there's an inverse correlation between unemployment rates and vacation times. Right? So again, on face value, it looks like a decent argument. It looks like it makes sense. But let's look a little closer. Let's look at what jumps he makes between the evidence and the conclusion. So here, we know that both of these talk about vacation times, but the causative factors for these changes between the evidence and the conclusion. So in the evidence, notice how he uses the word unemployment rates. This is a global phenomenon, right? But then in the conclusion, he talks about workers' perception of their own job security, right? And this is a very personal thing. Think about this. Is unemployment rate, a global phenomenon, necessarily linked with a person's job security or a person's feeling of job security? Not necessarily. A person's job security probably is based on how he performs or his relationship with his boss, or whether he's been goofing off at work, right? It may be dependent on unemployment rates, global unemployment rates, but it's extremely rare that it is. Excuse me. Right, sorry about that. So in a sense, what is the author thinking? Or what is the author taking for granted? What is he assuming to come out with the conclusion that job security or perception of job security is the reason for vacation frequencies? Well, he's assuming that there is some kind of correlation, there's some kind of way for a person to, correlate unemployment rates with job security. In other words, to make a prediction, I would say the assumption is that there is a correlation between job security and unemployment rates. Makes sense? What we just did is we looked at details, we looked at the most important details there, we saw what jumps he made. All we had to do is look between the two things, and we realized that, yeah, that is what he's taking for granted. It becomes very obvious once you put it down on your noteboard, right? And that's why it's very important to put things down on noteboard. So let's go to the answer options now. We've made a prediction of what the assumption should be, right? And let's go to the answer options. A says, the people who take the longest vacations when unemployment rates are low have no fear of losing their jobs. Are we really bothered only about people who take the longest vacation? Does it talk about unemployment rates? Yes, it does. But does it talk about job security and how it is related to unemployment rates? Not really. It's talking very narrowly about people who take the longest vacations. And this, although may seem like an assumption or something that the author is taking for granted, you realize that this has nothing to do with the core essence of what the author says. In other words, the assumption of an argument cannot be just some detail that the author assumes. It has to be a very integral part of the argument. If the assumption is proven wrong, the argument will fall apart, right? So you need to pick an answer option. For these assumption questions, you need to pick an answer option that is integral to the health of the argument, which without it, the argument will fall apart. And A, without it, well, nothing happens to the argument, right? So it's not really an essential argument. Let me get rid of that essential assumption. B, the travel costs are lower during times of low unemployment. On face value, you probably think, you know what, travel costs have nothing to do with this. And you're right, travel costs have nothing to do with what the assumption is assuming about, right? We are talking about job security and unemployment rates and connecting those two things. This does not fix that problem. Most people prefer to work full-time jobs. Are we bothered about full-time versus part-time? Not really, because the scope is about full-time, but more precisely, it's about job security and unemployment rates. Workers' perception of their own job security are in some way related to the unemployment rates. Sounds familiar, right? This is pretty much what we predicted. This was our prediction. This was what we figured out should be the assumption that fixes the problem with the argument. Sounds perfect. Let's just keep it there just in case. And the last one, workers' fear of losing their job has increased recently. Does it talk about unemployment rate? Does it talk about job security? Not necessarily. It's quite vague. Doesn't really address the key components of the argument. And D is your answer, right? It seems almost too easy, but trust me, once you start approaching an argument or a critical reasoning question strategically and methodologically without skipping steps, by paraphrasing the right things and by evaluating the different data that you have, the attention to the right details, you'll realize that getting to the right answer is not so tricky after all.